351, I'm on scene. I'll be assuming Caroline Street Command. I got a 2.5-story wood occupied multiple dwelling. I got heavy fire from the second floor, Charlie side. I have an exposure on the Delta side. We have one line stretch not in operation yet. Primary searches are underway. Status of the fire is doubtful. One passing command. I'm on the first line. Service speed advisor on scene. 2-story wood frame. I got heavy fire from the Alpha side.
Hello, fans of the Volley Chief podcast. Welcome back. I have a exciting episode today. This is going to start my BF Goodrich or Sponge Rubber, depending on how you know it, fire series. And again, I don't want to give too much away, but this will be the first of several episodes where we discuss the BF Goodrich explosion and fire, the effects it had on the valley, and even what happened. So in order to bring this story to you, I had to dig into history, and everybody in my area knows when you need to dig into history, especially fire history, there's only one person to call. So I'm going to allow him to introduce himself, and we're going to start our chat. So go ahead, Chief.
How you doing, Dave? This is Rob Novak calling. I actually am an assistant chief in the Bridgeport Fire Department Special Services Division. I also was the executive director of Derby Historical Society for 15 years. And I'm still Shelton's municipal historian. You talk about the Sponge Rubber explosion. You know, it was an interesting sequence of events, both leading up to and after the explosion. But let me just tell you a little bit about how we got there. The plant itself was started getting built in 1898. It was built, many additions after that. It was actually a textile mill. It was bought out in the 1950s by B.F. Goodrich. B.F. Goodrich, at its height in the mid-1960s, had 2,300 employees.
Was that at the Valley site?
That was amongst all 5 of their plants. There was one in Derby and the rest were in Shelton.
Okay, so I mean, that's a massive employer.
Yes. They made foam rubber for mattresses and furniture, life preservers, and rubber automobile parts. But by the end of the 60s, they were getting pressure from environmentalists. Residents were complaining about stinging eyes from air pollution. They spent millions of dollars on emissions control. In mid-January 1974, Shelton was rocked with the news that B.F. Goodrich was closing. Now, they were down to 2,000 employees. They said that if it was going to completely shut down if a buyer was not found within 6 months. There was even a attempt by employees to do a buyout, but it fell flat. In the 11th hour, literally, in early March of 1974, Grand Sheet Metals, headed by Ohio industrialist Charles Moeller, he had a reputation for being a maverick self-made millionaire, decided that they were going to buy the plant inventory and take control of the plant. Now, it was an interesting dynamic because they owned the plant contents, basically everything they produced. But you know what they didn't own? They didn't own the plant.
Okay.
That still was owned by B.F. Goodrich. Now, they were in negotiations up until the explosion to buy the plant, but with all of the obstacles to buying it, including like where their property, there were like intrusions on the property and they were like within setbacks and stuff like that. It kept getting tied up. That really wasn't Grand Sheet Metals' fault. That was more because you had a nearly 100-year-old factory that didn't really conform to current zoning standards. But Grand Sheet Metals, while they were seen as and they were basically, I should add, they went back to their company's old name, which was the Sponge Rubber Products Company. Everyone still called it B.F. Goodrich, though, BFG, even though B.F. Goodrich, for all intents and purposes, had left town. They did some pretty crazy things over at Grand Sheet Metals. First of all, they had a zero inventory policy, which meant that they had basically nothing in their warehouses. They also jacked up their prices considerably, which caused their biggest customer, Sears Roebuck, to basically say, you know what, we're going to get our products from somewhere else. That was a huge financial setback for them, and other customers also followed suit. By the end of 1974, while 1,500 people were employed at the beginning of the year at BF Goodrich, the Sponge Rubber Products Company was down to 900 employees. That kind of leads us to the explosion itself, which
Now, the plant, for those of you unfamiliar with the area, the plant sat on Canal Street in Shelton,
yes,
and it's bordered on, for us in the fire service on the A side by Canal Street. The B side was similar mill buildings. The C side was the Housatonic River,
yes.
and the D side is now Route 8.
Well, there was also Oates Brothers Trucking,
Okay.
just below it and across the street. I should also add the A side, Canal Street. Also, first of all, it was 2.5 blocks long. It was a huge plant. Um, it actually had a railroad spur where there was box cars and a tank car parked on the night of March 1st, 1975, and also the canal itself. Now, in that area, the canal actually was underground, but there were little oh, I forget what they called it. I used to know the term for it, but they were basically covers that they could open where they could actually tap directly into the canal and draft. I actually, in subsequent fires in the 1990s, remember using that system.
I believe they still use them at Star Pin.
Yes, yeah, that
Yep.
doesn't surprise me at all. But yeah, it was a very, very congested industrial area.
And then I mean, obviously, spoiler alert, we all know why we're talking about it. Now it's commonly referred to as the slab, which it's really become a riverside park. If you're driving through the valley and you're coming down Route 8 and you look down into downtown Shelton, you'll see the grass area with the gazebo. That is the area that we speak of today.
Yeah, and actually, how it became the park is an interesting story in of itself. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. But yeah, it was like a scar on Shelton. And it really was the very first Canal Street building it wasn't the first Canal Street building to burn. There were lots of fires before that, but it was the first one not to be rebuilt. And it really did signal in a spectacular fashion kind of the end of not just Shelton, but the Valley's industrial era. You mentioned the Commodore Hall Bridge being just below it. And I got actually a funny story about that later. But that bridge at the time was near the beginning of the Ansonia Derby Shelton Expressway. There was also another expressway down in Bridgeport, and I mentioned that because when the plant blew up, they were actually trying to connect the two expressways into the Route 8 that we know it today. That kind of opened up the valley in a way that it never had before to the outside world, made it easy to get in, easy to get out. So the days of living, working, and shopping in the valley, for most of the valley residents anyway, those days kind of came to an end, and the sponge rubber explosion really kind of, in spectacular fashion, signaled the end of that.
Now, you mentioned it was one of multiple plants.
Yes.
So where were the other plants?
Plant one was where the what later became Derby Cellular was
Okay.
located on Route 34 in Derby. Plant two had long since closed. That was actually that building's still standing. It's a multi-use building. I believe it's on the corner of it's on Howe Avenue. I believe it's on the corner of Hill Street. Actually, it's between Hill Street and Bridge Street. It's a multi-use building now. Um, Plant three, I believe, was the old Derby Silver Company on Bridge Street. Of course, Plant four is what blew up. Trying to remember where Plant five was. Plant six was located directly across the street, and that's an interesting story because that's the current inline plastics, and that was actually originally formed by employees of the Sponge Rubber Company after it blew up. But there was a conveyor belt that almost looked like a catwalk. A lot of people mistook it for like a bridge between the two buildings, but it
Yes.
actually was a conveyor belt, and it went over Canal Street, literally connecting Plant 4 with Plant 6. I'm trying to look up where. So, I mean, I can, if you have any more questions about the
No, I wonder
valley,
because
go
I
ahead.
actually I had somebody send me the other day that they were cleaning out a room in the Bagassets, and they found the what it's funny because we talk about stuff nowadays, but the April 1962 BF Goodrich Plant 4 pre-plan of
Wow.
where the Derby apparatus are supposed to respond. And as you mentioned, about Route 8, I find it funny because it refers to the new bridge. And it took me a minute to figure out what they were talking about because it says that
Sure.
the engines will proceed to the new bridge and then down Wharf Street.
Well, yeah, there had never been a bridge there before,
Right. So I'm assuming that
unlike the
that
Derby Shelton Bridge.
yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned that. I actually did my first BF Goodrich interview when I interviewed Paul Kasimer, long since departed police officer, in 1995. Um, 25 years ago, in 2000, I did a very big series of articles for what was then the Huntington Herald, and they got to be pretty lengthy. And to their credit, the Herald published them in their entirety. But what was interesting then is that, you know, it was a 25th anniversary then, and so it was 25 years ago, celebrating what happened 25 years before that. And I had a chance to interview a lot of people who were in positions to make decisions, including your own grandfather, who just, you know, they are not with us anymore. They've passed on. So I'm kind of, you know, I'm kind of thankful for that because I got some really great gripping eyewitness accounts of, you know, what happened, not just by people who, well, you know, I was a teenager. No, these are the people who are actually, you know, the lieutenants, the chiefs, the that were there at the time.
Yeah, we have coming up in a couple of episodes. I actually sat. There are five members of the Storms that are still active, in the fire company today that fought the fire.
Yeah, I'm sure they have gripping accounts as well. I mean, I can get into the fire a little bit if you want.
Yeah,
Whatever you'd
so
like to
let's
do.
let take it's funny because I tell everyone, obviously in my family that day is talked about. It was growing up. I always comment that the calendar doesn't hit March 1st that I don't think of it because
Oh yeah.
at some point on March 1st we got the story.
Yep.
And for me, the story actually had three parts, and part number one was my grandfather being the fire commissioner in Derby at the time, and his position. Part number two is my father being a newer firefighter at the time.
Yes.
And then part number three is my mother. A lot of people aren't aware that minutes before the BF Goodrich, the incident, the Derby had a fire at Hull-Dye. And a lot of members of the Storms and even the Hotchkiss, they were back at the firehouses by minutes cleaning up. And my mother tells the story that she was standing right in front of the Storms, and obviously, things people don't understand about the valley, the Storms firehouse. If you pull out of the firehouse, the road looks directly at the plant,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
that they watched it blow up.
And I actually talked to an eyewitness account from he was 15 years old at the time, but he lived on Hill Street. And if you know Shelton, you know
Yep.
Hill Street has a panoramic view of the plant too. He thought that he said it was like something out of the movies. He thought that the explosions maybe lasted about 90 seconds because, and I'll get into this later, there was actually, they took a considerable amount of time stringing explosives across the entire 2.5 block length of the plant. And, you know, I'm sure there were a lot of World War II veterans there who were familiar with demolitions. It just went right down the string. So, you know, a group of windows would blow out and people would be like, oh my God, what was that? Then the next group of windows would blow out all the way down from one end to the other until the entire plant was just a ball of fire. I mean, it was spectacular the way they did it. And it all actually started with at the guard shack. There used to be one on Wharf Street. One of the security guards, Alton Hanley, I actually knew his brother, they're all deceased now, was relieved by security guard Roy Rano, and all of a sudden both of them felt muzzles of guns against their backs of their necks don't turn around or I'll blow your head off. There were 3 men wearing ski masks. They handcuffed their arms behind their backs, took them into the plant, saying, "Don't be brave and you won't get hurt." They took him into one of the ladies' rooms. They asked if there was anybody else in the plant. They said, "Yeah, a boiler fireman, Robert DeJoy." They went into the boiler, did the same thing with him. They put them in a car. They actually took one of their cars, one of the victims' cars, and they drove to right about where Route 111 meets Route 34 in Stevenson, which was much more heavily wooded than it is today. Along the way, the kidnappers were basically saying, "Have you ever heard of the Weathermen?" Which is, they were trying to throw them off their trail. Now, the Weathermen was later renamed to Weather Underground, which some people may be familiar with. Vietnam era terrorist group, which there's echoes of them still around today. So Rano replied, "Only what I've read in papers." And one of the kidnappers said, "Well, you're about to hear more about them now because we're going to blow this place up." Okay, mistake number 1. They took the men into the woods and they kept saying, "As long as you cooperate, we're not going to hurt you." These men were arsonists. They were not murderers, and they certainly weren't very good kidnappers. Okay, they took them into the woods. They actually replaced their ropes with duct tape, kept the blindfolds on, and said, "You guys should be able to get out of this tape eventually. When you do, wait half an hour, and you'll find the keys to your car on the ground, under the bumper, under the rear bumper. Don't try to be a hero." And then they drove off. This is before it exploded. So, of course, these guys are petrified at this point. They basically did what they were told. They got out of their bounds. They waited a little bit. They got back to their car. The keys were exactly where the very nice arsonist said that they would be. And they got in their car. Now they're driving down Route 110, and of course by now the sky is, red. And they knew, okay, the Weather Underground must have blown up our plant. By this point, these guys were basically declared, presumed dead.
Correct.
They run into the Shelton police station, which was then located on the corner of, it was on Howe Avenue, very close to Bridge Street. Some may remember that prior to 1961, the Echo Hose Hook and Ladder was there too. They run inside, and I believe it was Robert White, who would later become the chief of police in Shelton. They looked like they had seen some ghosts when they ran in. And they were like, they tell the story. We had been kidnapped. We were dropped off in Monroe. Now we're back here. They said, "Well, who did this to you?" They said, "Well, they said that they were the Weathermen." They're like, "The Weathermen?" Now, granted, the Weathermen at the time had a reputation of blowing up defense plants. Plant that's making life preservers isn't exactly considered that, but hey, that's enough.
Right.
So guess who the Shelton police called? The FBI. Didn't take the FBI long to realize it wasn't the Weather Underground, because they would never blow up a plant like that. But since they were there, they may as well solve the crime. They sent about 24 field agents and probably did a much better investigation than local resources would have done. Let's just put it that way. But the explosion it was massive. A bunch of people were at the East End Hose Company 3 in Derby. I think it was a past captain's night. And some people had gone home, including your grandfather, Eddie Cotter. A lot of them kind of stayed for the after party. They actually heard the boom, and then the fire siren went off. They started heading down there. One of the Shelton police officers got on the scanner and yelled, "Jesus Christ, B.F. Goodrich just exploded." Your grandfather, Ed Cotter, actually, he actually told this to me. He had just gotten back to his house. Maybe it was for that Hull Dye fire he just mentioned. He had just gotten back to his house on, I think it was Mohawk Lane. He actually, it's funny you mentioned Olivia Street Hill. He went over the Olivia Street Hill and could see this massive flame. He actually got on the New Haven County mutual aid frequency and said, "Is anybody monitoring this frequency?" A Mrs. Palmer, who was a dispatcher out of Oxford, answered, "Yeah, I'm here." And so did a Derby police dispatcher. He said, "We have a disaster in Shelton. Start moving fire equipment there. Just start heading for downtown Shelton. You're not going to need directions." um, like I said,
I always laugh because I heard that, we heard that story time and time again, growing up.
yes.
And it really, uh, you know, you don't realize the actions that were taken that night. And, when you read about what some of the members did, the actions they took, and it is just incredible, the heroism that night of some of those guys.
Well, I actually talked to, I got a chance to talk to former, now deceased Shelton Fire Chief Richard Tallberg. He actually entered the structure, the main entrance of the structure, with four others. They got about 30 feet into the building before being driven back by intense heat and secondary explosions. Of course, this is a central hallway that goes about 2.5 blocks. And he said it just looked like an oven. It was the spookiest thing, and there were secondary explosions. After the fire, Dick Tallberg, as he was known as, retraced his steps, and he found a 6 square foot hole blasted into the concrete floor. Apparently, this is where one of the 50-gallon gasoline drums were. Had they proceeded, they would have fallen through the hole, and that certainly would have been the end of them. What basically ensued after that was Shelton and the other Fairfield County apparatus pretty much made their stand on Wharf Street, which was the southernmost point. That's actually where the guard shack was. A small cross street, very close to the Commodore Hull Bridge, while the New Haven County fire apparatus under your grandfather Eddie Cotter's command made their stand above. There was another factory just above it called the Shelton Tack Company.
Which would meet us, ironically, similar fate.
Yes. Oh no. Most of these old buildings did burn along Canal Street, including the Tack Company. In fact, it's part of the same. It's part of the same Riverwalk Park that the old Plant 4 is now. But it's funny. I talked to so many people and got their first impressions. Oh my God, stuff like that. I know. I'm trying to find the part. You'll have to excuse me. I'm scrolling here. Oh yeah, I got to the part where your grandfather, Alfred Totora, ran up to him saying, "Our guards are missing. They may be in the powerhouse." Now, of course, these are the same guards who are currently sitting in the woods in Monroe. The powerhouse was searched, but nothing was found. At some point, I know that tanks that were located there containing a chemical, trying to find what it was now, it's methyl ethyl bad stuff, were removed by hand and placed in the Shelton Tack Company building. Fortunately, the wind was blowing south, and that would have been towards the Commodore Hull Bridge. A couple interesting anecdotes. Chief Brainerd, even though other people came on scene with a lot more experience, Chief Brainerd was the chief of the Shelton Fire Department, offering to take overall command. He kept command the entire time. He decided he was going to use his words, fight the fire from the air. At one point, there were 9 aerial devices, and for some reason, he became fixated on snorkels. They called snorkels from Norwalk, Cheshire, Stratford. Bridgeport had a snorkel at the time, but I talked to Captain Billy Hogue, now retired from Bridgeport. Apparently, they were fighting their own fire.
Yeah, it's funny. And obviously the connection of Bridgeport made me read it a little bit further, but I found just recently an article about BF, and it references the large mutual aid response, and it actually notes that because Bridgeport wasn't on the county mutual aid system, they were not called.
Yeah, it was very rare for mutual aid to go
it was a
around
very
Bridgeport at
weird,
the time.
very weird reasoning for them not going.
A couple interesting anecdotes about the snorkel, though. Norwalk's was an open cab like no roof on it. And they came all the way from Norwalk. And of course, this is the middle of the night on a very cold March 1st. So they must have been freezing. Hamden also sent a snorkel. Every fire engine out of the Echo Hose Company responded, and it had quite a few fire engines in there at the time, including Engine 1, which was a 1939 Ahern's pump known as Jumbo. It's still there. You can Echo Hose Jumbo, look it up on Google. It's a kind of a really cool rig. But they actually popped its clutch in order to start it. When they got on scene, some accounts vary. Some say it was Cheshire, the others say it was Hamden. They were told to basically feed one of the aerials. And the out-of-towners were like, "Are you kidding me? That old relic is going to feed us?" So they hook up to the hydrant or canal, whatever they were drafting from, and they opened it up. Now, Jumbo was specifically built for industrial firefighting. It could pump 1,800 gallons per minute without even breaking a sweat. They blew the tip off of the aerial ladder, and the out-of-town company said, could you please reduce the pressure?" We mentioned the Commodore Hall Bridge. I actually have a funny personal story I'd like to tell you at this time. The Milford Fire Department sent their ladder truck and possibly an engine, I'm not sure. I mention that because at the time, my family briefly had lived in the Devon section. In fact, the same road that the Devon Hose Company 4, now known as Milford Engine 4, were located. My father actually, now we were just closing on the house that they still live on in Huntington Center. We actually drove to Shelton to watch the fire. Now I was 5 years old at the time. So this is my 5-year-old memory, trying to make sense, 50 years later. I just remember at almost every intersection in Shelton, there was a fire engine. Something was pumping out of a hydrant. There was hose everywhere, fire everywhere. We crossed the Derby-Shelton Bridge into Derby. Then we got on the Commodore Hall Bridge. This was just prior to the state police shutting it down because of the thick smoke that was blowing over the Commodore Hall Bridge. But I distinctly, and I can still remember it as clear as day, looking down the Commodore Hall Bridge at the factory. And I was no stranger to the factory. I mean, God knows how many times we had crossed the Commodore Hall Bridge before. And just seeing this mass of flame. I distinctly remember the Echo's Emergency 5. That was a rescue truck at the time down there because it had a distinct profile, and lots of other engines. But one thing stuck in my mind. I looked over the Housatonic River, and it honest to God looked like the water was on fire. Now, after that, I remember telling my little friends, "Wow, I saw that big fire. Even the water was on fire." Haha, okay, stupid kid. But as I processed that as I got older, I was like, okay, you were a cute, dumb kid at the time. There's no way the water could have been on fire. It had to be reflections of the water, of the fire on the water. Okay, fair enough. While conducting a lot of these interviews I conducted 25 years ago, it might have been Dick Tallberg, somebody told me, oh yeah, and then at one point, liquid latex rubber leached into the Housatonic River and ignited. I was like, so you're telling me there was fire on the water? Yeah. Dave, I was 5 years old. I can still to this, I will never be able to definitively identify what I saw, but that the water was on fire theory I had as a 5-year-old is still valid today. I don't know what I saw, but to this day, I can still picture it, and it sure looks like hell like that water is on fire. Maybe that's what I saw, maybe not. I don't know. But
now, Chief, with your research, what do you have for the farthest mutual aid?
I know Cheshire was there. I know Norwalk was there. Hamden, the New Haven Fire Department did respond. That would probably be it. They were specifically saying they wanted snorkels, and again, I don't know why. Maybe they were watching Emergency. That was actually in prime time at the time, so who knows? But I know that they were calling far and wide for aerial devices. I'm pretty sure Waterbury, New Haven, Hamden, Norwalk. If there may have been further out, I don't know. I do have an after-action report. Unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me that lists all the towns that went. I'd have to dig that up in my files. I can probably provide that at a later time if you want.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, yeah, it's like a two-page thing that Leroy Brainerd, the fire chief, put together. Um, in fact, while we were talking about it, I actually can quote how that report ended, though. He said, "The amazing part of the whole fire is that all firemen from every town and company, whether paid or volunteer, stood shoulder to shoulder in the freezing temperatures with only one purpose, to stop the fire so the city of Shelton could survive this Holocaust and continue to function." That's actually a pretty darn good segue because it looked pretty bleak after the fire. Um, they in the first couple of days they were still trying to sort out what the hell was going on. Was this a terrorist attack? What had happened? Um, the unemployment in the valley jumped to, or in Shelton actually jumped to 11.5%. They actually set up an unemployment office in a school, the Fowler School, which is now Shelton City Hall, just to process the unemployment claims. There was I'm sorry, I'm looking at my facts right now. The unemployment in Shelton actually leapt to 12%. 900 people were suddenly laid idle. And I talked to a number of employees who worked there. They used to bring their own tools there. And a lot of them lost the tools of their trade in that fire as well. A lengthy series of trials followed. 12 people were indicted. 10 actually went to jail. The only ones who didn't was the president, Charles Moeller, as well as the driver of the Avis rental truck that they picked up in Pittsburgh or Butler, Pennsylvania, somewhere around there, which carried all the explosives. He truly had no idea what was going on. One of the arsonists actually turned state witness, and he only did 24 months. Pretty much everybody involved there, if they're still alive, are out of jail. One of the most flamboyant was Reverend Bubar, who was a spiritual advisor for Charles Moeller. Very flamboyant. He actually went on a hunger strike while he was on jail until God told him 11 days later that he should eat. Apparently he was accused of trying to bribe Charles Moeller to keep his mouth shut. He went to jail for a while. But it's interesting because I remember reading an article not that long ago where they asked a Shelton official, I think it was the mayor's aide at the time, after the latest trial and indictments, stuff like that. And he was just like, yeah, that's all great, but, how do I rebuild my city? And I mentioned how Route 8 kind of was pushed through after that. There was a huge spur of development of both light industrial research as well as office buildings that were built in Huntington not long after. One by one, the factories along Canal Street, you mentioned Starpin, that was another one, did shut down to the point where really Canal Street, I don't think there's any industrial activity there at all anymore. Chromium process might have been one of the last ones. But it's funny how they both happened in 1975. The March 1st, 1975 explosion, as well as the opening of Route 8, leaving a clear path from Seymour all the way down to Bridgeport via expressway, really were just two bookends where you could really, it's one of those rare occasions where you can definitively look at, both Shelton and the Valley's history and say, this is really when we turn the page into a whole nother era.
And it's crazy because you think about, the members that time, 75, if again, if you were young enough when you first joined, you had 30 years in, you lived through the 55 floods, you lived, and then you'd have BF in 75, you'd have Huldai, which, was like you said, plant number one would go down in a spectacular fire. And that was in 1982.
Well, that was actually Derby Cellular, but correct. Yeah, Huldai was right next door. Yeah.
and then right after that, the River Restaurant. I mean, you're talking a 10-year window
Yeah.
where if you were a fireman in Ansonia, Derby, or Shelton, it it was a lot.
Well, I still remember because the next really big fire on Canal Street, February 26, 1989. I remember they were having a past captain's night actually at the Huntington Fire Company where I was a member. And that was the former Beard building. It was a three-story building. This was on the other side of Canal Street, north of Bridge Street. But we went through like a 10 to 15 year era where so many of those old buildings just burned down.
Yeah, I mean, right, because now you're jogging, right? You had obviously BF was 75,
Right.
and you in 89 you had Beard. I mean, just going through downtown Shelton in my
Yep.
mind,
I mean,
you 93, I think it was Samarius, which you mentioned earlier.
oh, there were quite a few along the canal at that time. But yeah,
Right. I
and you
I
mentioned
mean,
River Restaurant. That's true, but that was in the commercial zone. I'm talking the industrial zone.
oh, absolutely. I mean, and you're not even talking the Boys and Girls Club, Hunter's Corner. Like you're staying a block south of that.
Right. Right.
And in that, I mean, even up until I mean, Star Pin just a few years ago, but even before that, I think it was 2003. We had the another large fire on Canal Street. We were at all night.
Yep.
You know, the,
Starpin really made me sad because I was really hoping that we could preserve that building. It had a very unique architecture, 5 stories. It was one of the oldest buildings that was built left along the canal. Unfortunately, it was a classic case of what we see so often, not just the valley, but any industrial area, Bridgeport, New Haven, Waterbury included. I call it demolition by neglect. Hello, Main Street Derby. Um, where just the buildings are just left to fall down until they're finally condemned or they burn down. And unfortunately, that's what befell Starpin. What made Plant 4 stick out, though, is that this was an active industrial center. It was one of the biggest employers of the valley. I think it was right up there with Farrell's and at the time, in Ansonia and Derby.
and again, it's crazy because as you mentioned, you talk about the history of the valley and you talk about what had gone on, and it's the floods. You can go back a little bit earlier. You had the lumberyard fire in the 30s in downtown Derby. Turn of the century, late 1800s, you had the Great Derby Fire. But you have all those events, and for such a small area, you're looking at roughly once a decade some
Yeah.
type of major disaster event.
Oh, it was much more frequent in the 80s and 90s, but yeah, in early 2000s. But yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Uh, I mean, it is. It's and I'm trying to think of some of the other. I still think of some of the other. A lot of us spent a lot of time on Canal Street.
Well,
I
you
mean,
mentioned Shelton Tack.
oh,
There were
we
at least two
mentioned
good
Shelton
ones in
Tech.
there.
Yeah.
How many times did Chromium Process catch fire? The building across the street from it, Samarius, that burned at least 3 times. I don't think yeah, there were a few of them. Starpin. Um, oh, I can't remember what building.
Satin America. Where was that? Was that?
Satin America would have been across from Chromium Pro. You know where the railroad spur crossed Canal Street?
Yes.
It would be the building just below that.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Satin America. I'm sorry. I'm thinking Samarius. Satin America. That also occurred in 1989. I apologize. That was down. That was down on Platte Road.
Okay.
Not in downtown Shelton.
I mean, it's crazy though, because like I'm just thinking, there's been so many large fires in downtown Shelton that you forget them.
Yeah, well, that's how. And it's funny. It was such a big deal at the time. Remember the Shelton Derby Boys and Girls Club?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean there was just so many down in that area. Fortunately, downtown Shelton is redeveloping. Some like the changes, some don't. It definitely is different downtown from how I remember. I remember Charles Kaseimer, the cop I told you about, who's long since passed away. He was also a very avid photographer. His photo collections at the Plum Memorial Library in Shelton. He used to describe downtown Shelton as honky tonk, and I agree.
Yeah. And now the legacy of BF, right? Because it's my understanding, and again, you're the expert. Correct me if I'm wrong, but BF would turn into latex foam.
Well, there were three actually.
Okay.
Plant 3, which was the former Derby Silver Company on the corner of Bridge and Canal Streets, became Housatonic Everfloat. That later you probably remember it better as Spongex.
Yep. Few
Latex foam.
fires in that building.
Yeah, oh yeah, I went to a few of those too. Latex foam opened in the former Plant 6, which you now know as Inline Plastics. 80 former sponge workers were hired there. And by the way, these places I'm mentioning were all formed by former managers, local managers of the Sponge Rubber Company. They made pillows, mattresses, furniture cushions using machines salvaged from Plant 4. They later moved to another factory in Ansonia, which was a former American Brass Company building. Unfortunately, that burned down in spectacular fashion, reminded many of the Plant 4 fire.
It's funny because, interviewing my father for BF, I said, did you ever think in a million years that 25 years from now, my kids will be fighting,
Yeah,
the,
yeah,
the
another
next,
rubber
the
company
next
fire. Yeah,
one?
yeah. No, I still remember because I was actually at the Historical Society back then, the David Humphreys House on Elm Street, Ansonia, and burning rubber products were falling all over us. I was so sure that our cedar shakes were going to catch fire, but fortunately they didn't. But I went to the scene later. I can still tell you that I believe that was April 15th, April 14 or 15, 2001. Um, that was
Of which
amazing.
one? BF?
No,
Oh,
latex
sorry.
foam.
Latex was
Latex foam.
May 14th,
May 14th. Yeah. Did I say
2001.
April? I'm sorry, May 14th.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember there was another bad fire in Trumbull that was on May Day. Yeah, April 1st. And then, yeah, 14 days later, yeah, we had latex foam. Trying to think, there was a third. Oh, yeah, already mentioned Derby Cellular. That was also formed by former BF, I still call them BF Goodrich, Sponge Rubber Company employees. And, that kept people employed for another generation as well.
And then after leaving latex foam, after the fire in Ansonia, they would move back to Shelton. And they had a fire in
Yeah.
there in early 2014, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. That was down on River Road.
Yep.
Not if you know River Road, not far from where the Riverdale Diner is today.
I
That
find it, you hate to say it, but what constitutes a curse?
yeah, I know.
Uh, and
I
and again, no one, correct me if no one died as a result of the explosion in the fire, and injuries were minor. I've never heard of anybody being seriously injured.
There were injuries, but they all were frostbite or slips and falls. No burns or anything like that. Nothing serious. It's a funny. You mentioned the park that's there today. For a long time that was a scar. I mean, there were old trucks parked there, piles of fill, piles of construction debris. Looked really ugly. It was called the slab for a reason. Uh, they actually, I can't remember what agency they went through, but they actually received funding to turn it into a grassy park. But the idea was that they were going to build a river walk along the riverfront, something that would have been inconceivable when Plant 4 was there or when the tack company was there, because it was basically a tack company property, which was relatively small compared to the Sponge Rubber Products Company. But it was zoned light industrial. And the whole idea was that you were supposed to build a light industrial building, kind of similar to what Inline Plastics is today there. But after a while, they started hosting stuff like, carnivals. I remember seeing Boy Scouts camping there, little fairs and stuff like that. And it kind of became almost the town green that downtown Shelton never really had. Um, the closest green to downtown Shelton is either in Derby or Huntington. Um, they actually had to jump through a number of hoops, and the feds weren't thrilled with us, thrilled with Shelton initially, where we basically said, yeah, we want to change the designation of this land from light industrial to parkland. And it took some hoops, some hoop jumping to get there. But eventually it was actually designated as a park. And the Riverwalk actually now, geez, that extends halfway up the northern part of Canal Street. The idea is to get it all the way to the canal lock. Oh yeah, that's another fire we forgot, didn't we? The building at the very top of it. What was that? The old Derby paper mill. And that burned down too. Yeah. But
Well, what are your final thoughts? Do you think that the BF Goodrich fire will be long remembered in the valley, or do you think it's largely, forgotten?
it should be, as long as there's fire geeks and history geeks like you and me, it will be. First of all, it really is a watershed moment. It's one of those few times where we can say between Route 8 and the explosion, what the valley looked like before versus what the valley looked after really were two distinct chapters. And it's a little unusual, short of a war, where you can actually make that claim. I think it's a watershed moment, both in the valley's history, as of course in Shelton's history, and in fire department history. I mean, I believe I think it still remains as the biggest arson case not caused by domestic terrorism, even though they thought it was at first, in FBI history.
Yeah, I remember they said it was the largest case of industrial arson in U.S. history.
Yes,
until like a few years ago, there was another one that dethroned it. But
well, it wouldn't surprise me, and I don't know if we're accounting for inflation or not. Some may argue the Murrah building out in Oklahoma City might qualify for that, but that was domestic terrorism.
Correct. An ironic thing about the Storm Engine Company and the BF fire is there's not a single photo of the BF fire explosion hanging up in the storms.
Really?
And I always found that a little bit ironic and comical, given the fact that, my grandfather being there for so long.
Yeah, your grandfather was the high watermark of photographers. He worked for the Sentinel at the time. Yeah. They were probably too busy fighting the fire.
Yeah, and I mean, and I have not seen a lot of photos of the fire. Which, again, I mean, it happened at night. It was in the 70s. It's not like, nowadays where everyone's running around. For the kids listening, back then, telephones were connected by wire. And, you had a roll of film that only took 12 to 20 pictures. But that's one thing I've always wanted to try to find, more photos, because that's one thing I think, even if you Google, there's not a lot of pictures of it.
Yeah, I maybe have about a dozen of them. And they're probably the same photos you have seen.
Correct.
Either found on the internet. Yeah, I mean, it was a cold, miserable night. And of course, I mean, I know you've seen these before too. After the fire, ice is everywhere. That accounted for many of the injuries that were there as well. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of, you talk about eras of firefighting. I mean, this is kind of the swan song of the three-quarter boots, trench coat, leather fire helmet, as long as the outfit fits you, it's fine. We're laying in with dual 3-inch lines at best, inch and a half. Kind of the the rough old way of fighting fires that it's different from how we do it today, where things are a little more technological in the age of 5-inch hose and self-encapsulating gear. It's not like they didn't have self-contained breathing apparatus back then, but I think that back then it would have been Scott 2As, and maybe each fire truck maybe had like 3 or 4 of them kept in the metal, not the metal, actually some were metal, but mostly plastic clamshells.
Yep.
I'm sure you remember seeing those.
And it's funny because, to start this this discussion, I actually posted a few things online asking for if anyone had photos, if anybody fought the fire. And I did receive, it's funny you mentioned Chief Tolberg, because his daughter sent me an email just, how her father would talk about it. And they lived about 3/4 of a mile from the plant.
Yep.
She was younger at the time, so she doesn't remember, but she said her father always spoke about it. And, obviously I remember Chief Tolberg a lot when we were younger and we were kids.
Well, he
And
gave a great interview 25 years ago. So did your grandfather too, by the way. They both did.
do you have those still, or?
I'd have to dig. I might have the original notes.
But
I mean,
yeah,
a lot. Actually, when I talk about the New Haven County side, in my articles, most of it, your grandfather is the primary source for that.
Yeah. We talk about it all the time because we said we should have sat him down in front of a video camera and said, just go, but it's interesting. And now, Chief, I thank you for your time. I really want to have you come back on because you did. I remember, one time we saw a flyer hanging up for a presentation at the Derby Library about the history of the Valley Fire Services, and my brother and I and a couple of us came down, and I loved it, and I'd love to talk to you, about the history of the fire companies in the Valley and all the information you've done on that. So I definitely want to have you back on.
Yeah, the Valley has a really interesting history when it comes to its fire service. I mean, it's like a mini New York, actually. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and then again, this is the kickoff of a couple BF episodes, so I thank you for helping me set the stage. Any last words?
No, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Chief, and I look forward to next time.
Thank you, Chief. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
FD1's back in service. Commands terminated.